So my talk today is in an area that's still, as Federico was mentioning, somewhat new to me, concerning various issues of science in society. That said, some earlier thoughts on this have just come out in a collection that I edited, published by Cambridge University Press, entitled Science and Humanism, Knowledge, Values, and the Common Good. And here's the cover. It's open access, so you can peruse the chapter titles and download anything you like, or a PDF of the whole book if you're that keen. It's on the CUP website, it's on my own website. Of course, if you're the sort of person that prefers to spend a large part of your salary so that you can hold something of substance in your hands, you know, I'm not going to dissuade you, but it's free for anyone who is content to read something on their screen or point out the relevant bits. All of that said, although the subject of education is implicit in a lot of what's happening in this book, I don't really discuss it there explicitly myself, but I think it's a key issue in the broader context of the book. And that's one of the motivations for me in thinking about these issues in some work that I'm doing now. Lately, concerning the public understanding of science, it seemed to me that the role that relatively early education plays in shaping it is going to be crucial for how we think about the roles that science plays in society, especially given the relatively small quantity of science education that most people will receive in their lifetimes. So that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. So here's a menu for the next 45 minutes. In section 1, I'm going to set the stage a little bit by motivating a philosophical reflection on education in this particular context. In section 2, I'm going to describe two families of critical engagement with the idea of scientific knowledge, what I'll call, on the one hand, science denialism, and on the other hand, epistemologies of science. These things, I think, complicate the project of even trying to specify what the epistemic aims of a science education should be. In light of this, in section 3, I'm going to reflect on some worries about epistemic paternalism and indoctrination that threaten to undermine the idea that having epistemic aims in this context is something that we can do, right? And suggest that some, but not all, of those sorts of concerns should be taken seriously. And then finally, in conclusion, I'll contend in section 4 that while not precluding belief in our best science, an attitude of acceptance regarding science is better equipped to facilitate whatever hopes we may have for the greater uptake of science in society, and also, simultaneously, to cope well with the complexities of commitments associated with these critical engagements with science. Now, of course, in suggesting that acceptance and not belief should be viewed as the primary aim, I don't want to suggest that belief is off the table. Belief should be regarded, I think, as an added bonus that's sometimes achievable, though in many circumstances, just not so much. And of course, by focusing here on epistemic aims, I'm leaving aside many other undoubtedly important aims, like inculcating an appreciation of the wonders of the natural and social worlds, instilling an understanding of the nature of observation and experimentation, right? Developing formal and informal skills of data analysis and modeling and reasoning, right? All of these things are important. None of them are disconnected from epistemic aims, but none of those things will be my primary focus in what follows. Right? So with all of that preliminary clarification, let me dig in. So I suspect it won't be a controversial thing for me to say, in this company at least, that public support for scientific research and science-based policies seems crucial to our collective well-being. The uptake of our best science in the public domain is a determining factor in how successfully we're able to tackle many of the challenges that we face. Poor distributions of well-being in the form of health or economic welfare, existential crises like climate change, and so on. And it goes without saying that the public understanding of science is a major determinant of the degree of public uptake of science that we're able to bring about. Right? And that science education is a major determinant of what later manifests as public understanding. Right? So in other words, education has a big impact on public understanding. Public understanding has a big impact on the uptake of science in society. And the uptake of science in society has a big impact on the common good. Right? So today what I want to do is focus in on the earliest stage of this chain of events, science education. And even more specifically, I want to focus on a particular pedagogical context, one that I identify loosely with what one might call general science education. So general science education is the sort of basic introductory exposure to the sciences that for many people will run its course in secondary school or perhaps in the early stages of a post-secondary education. A general science education can serve as a foundation for further, deeper, more detailed education that has the potential to yield varying degrees of specialist expertise. But for most people, exposure to science by means of formal education will end sooner rather than later. Right? A general science education is all the rigorous or systematic training that most people will ever receive. The fact that a majority of the adult members of our societies will have, at most, a general science education suggests that this sort of education in particular has a considerable role to play in the causal chain that I just mentioned, right? Leading from education to public understanding to policy and action. Which brings me to the question of how we should tackle this sort of education specifically. What do we aim to achieve, or rather, what should we aim to achieve in teaching science at this stage? As I mentioned earlier, just like in most education, and general education is something we might reasonably hope, like those other forms, to serve a number of different ends. Right? But I'm focusing here on the question of what our primary epistemic aim should be. By epistemic aim, I mean here an aim relating to belief or knowledge. Right? What sort of doxastic attitude should we manifest towards the content of our best science? What sort of belief or rival doxastic attitude should be our primary aim? I'm going to argue in what follows that the primary epistemic aim of a general science education is best thought of in terms of an attitude of acceptance of the content of scientific theories and models in contrast to belief. And I'll explain the details of this in just a little bit. Scientific investigation is often regarded as our highest, most successful mode of inquiry into facts about the natural and social worlds. And yet, as you know, if you watch the news or pay attention to anything at all, really, around us, in our area, the sciences are also subject to significant and in some cases widespread forms of skepticism and critique. Now, it may be tempting sometimes to diagnose negative assessments of the status of scientific theories and models in terms of simple failures to distinguish between, on the one hand, more speculative scientific conclusions drawn at relatively early stages of investigation, right, sort of cutting-edge science, and on the other hand, more secure findings based on further study and stronger evidence in the fullness of time. This, perhaps, would help us to explain at least some of the backlash against health advisories during the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? Regarding vaccines, in which researchers worldwide were kind of scrambling to explore the nature of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, right? Relatively early days. And so they were giving advisories based on information that could be described in some ways as relatively cutting edge. And those advisories changed over time, spawning a lot of confusion, right, in the public domain. So confusions between stages of scientific inquiry and what counts as more speculative and what counts as more settled, right, may well occur. Right? But the sorts of skepticism about and critique of science that I have in mind for today here are not obviously matters of simple confusion like that. Right? Rather, they're more principled sorts of skepticism and critique. Right? They're not the sort of thing you could resolved just by waving a distinction, right, at the problem. And as a result, I think these critiques and worries aren't really amenable to being easily dismissed or dissolved. So I'd like to divide these more principled forms of critique into two categories. Right? Each in their own way poses a strong challenge to how we think about science and how science education may help to promote our collective welfare, or not, as the case may be. But the challenges in each case are very different, so I want to take them in turn. Right? And let me refer to the first category, adopting a common term here, as science denialism. So science denialism has a couple of striking features. Right? For one thing, it opposes a strong or naively conceived account of science that we often describe in terms of scientism. Right? That is, an understanding of science as involving an especially forceful commitment to the authority or the authoritative jurisdiction of the sciences. Scientism is commonly viewed as a bad thing when the strength of those commitments is judged to be excessive. Right? So it amounts to a kind of hubris, right, on that, in that case, regarding the certainty of scientific claims or the notion that everything is, in principle, susceptible to an exhaustively scientific analysis or description. A rejection of this sort of hardcore scientism is common to all forms of science denialism. Right? But views subscribing to science denialism are not merely skeptical about scientism. Right? They're skeptical about science altogether. Right? They don't recognize the sciences as generating belief-worthy outputs at all, right? As the denial in the term denialism suggests. Right? Science denialism encourages an antipathy or hostility toward science, often driven by group identity commitments, championed by, for example, authority figures, parents, religious leaders, influential promoters of special interests in various communities. So these commitments are instilled in the members of these groups, including, for example, students at formative stages of education. And it goes without saying that commitments like these complicate the task of science pedagogy in ways that escalate the more deeply entrenched those commitments become. So let's consider these forms of denialism in turn, just to get a sense of what I have in mind here. So pseudosciences, like astrology and creationism, are generally described as non-scientific doctrines or practices that masquerade as science on the basis of some misleading characterizations of their investigative or analytical methods. There's an ongoing debate, as you know, about whether science and pseudoscience can be neatly distinguished in terms of their general features, or whether, and this is what I think probably the majority of people think, whether distinguishing them can only be done on a case-by-case basis. In any case, there's widespread agreement here about which doctrines and practices are, in fact, pseudoscientific. Anti-science is a catch-all for trenchant opposition to science, sometimes, but not always, involving the organized promotion of pseudoscience. The hallmark of anti-science, more generally, is the pursuit of non-epistemic ends, right? Like social or economic ends that would otherwise be hindered by scientific findings. So for example, here's an example involving pseudoscience. Homeopathists may seek to profit at the expense of genuinely effective treatments, right? Leaving placebo effects aside here, which complicates things a bit. But here's an example not involving pseudoscience. Tobacco companies and fossil fuel companies have famously promoted misleading research, in quotation marks, to undermine facts about the harms of secondhand smoke and climate change, respectively, which were established by the relevant sciences. And then rounding out this sort of rogues gallery of things to worry about, resistance to facts is a term that's recently come to refer to the fascinating social phenomenon of people having generic disinclinations, for whatever reason, to believe evidentially well-supported facts. So consider, for example, the anti-vaccination movement in many, perhaps not all, but in many cases. Now, clearly more could be said to spell out the subtleties of all of these forms of science denialism concerning our best science. I'm just scratching the surface here. But now what I want to do is turn to the other category of critical attitudes towards science that I promised just a moment ago, and I'm calling these epistemologies of science. So this category of critical engagement with the content of our best science is very familiar, of course, to philosophers, and is also, I think, commonly found in assessments of science by scientists, though they often describe these assessments in different terms than we might use. I think that's often merely just a reflection of our different use of technical terms. Epistemologies of science often share with science denialism a distaste for scientism, right? But for a different reason. That is, in the case of epistemologies of science, the reasons are taken to be serious, carefully articulated epistemological reasons for resisting scientism. We, and certainly philosophers of science, would describe these views, I believe, as more credible accounts of the epistemic upshot of our best science. Serious reflection on the nature of scientific practices by scientists, philosophers, historians, sociologists have yielded a variety of interpretive proposals for how best to understand the factual content of our best science. And a common way of framing these differences in terms of a debate that Federica mentioned that I've spent a lot of time over the years thinking about myself concerning the idea of scientific realism. Scientific realism, to a first approximation, is the view that scientific inquiry yields mind-independently true or approximately true descriptions of both observable and unobservable aspects of the world. The debates about scientific realism, though, are ongoing, right? They're unsettled. It wouldn't be wrong to say that they're perennial. There are some even who think that these debates may be unresolvable in principle, because at least some of the most carefully worked out proposals for how to interpret scientific knowledge turn on assumptions that can't be undermined by rival views without begging the question. Now, I'm not going to defend that particular diagnosis of debates about scientific realism today. For present purposes, it's enough just to note that there's genuine controversy here. Sorry, I think that's mine. It'll stop. Some, I think, worry about the epistemic implications of the fact that scientific knowledge evolves over time. That's a standard reason to be skeptical or worried about scientific knowledge. Some worry about the routine use of abstractions and idealizations in science. Others think that both of those worries are, in fact, properly understood, compatible with realism. Right? But nothing is settled. So here's a non-exhaustive, but still fairly comprehensive list of epistemologies of science. I'm not going to attempt to give a detailed description of any of them, most, if not all of which will be familiar to you, but let me at least mention some basic ideas. So versions of selective realism contend that some parts of our best science may be apt for skepticism, but others may be justifiably believed. Unfortunately, they just disagree about which parts are which. Right? Forms of empiricism and instrumentalism limit what we should take to be belief-worthy in science to claims describing observable things, and hold that strictly unobservable things are beyond our epistemic reach. But they disagree about how to spell that out. Neo-Kantian views subscribe to Kant's contention that our knowledge of the world is unavoidably permeated with specifically human concepts and categories, and thus take many scientific claims to be in various ways conventional. Of course, unlike Kant, they generally take the relevant concepts and categories to be revisable. They take them to be things that we revise over time. Right? The positions I've placed below the dotted line on this slide are often characterized by their advocates in what I would describe as a way that furnishes or incorporates epistemologies of science, or they're presented as being compatible with our best science. Sometimes, though, depending on which advocate you ask, they're characterized differently. And in some of those cases, they may seem more like forms of science denialism. So for example, pragmatists articulate the notion of having justified beliefs in terms of their utility and are typically skeptical of the idea of mind-independent truth. In some cases, I think that's compatible with realism. In others, it's compatible with a very strong sort of conventionalism, according to which science is merely one ideology among others. Right? I mean, for example, Richard Rorty says things like that very explicitly. Some versions of social constructivism concern only the ways in which social and economic and political relations shape scientific beliefs, but others go further, deflating the epistemic status of scientific descriptions into mere social statuses, right, which have no special epistemic privilege as such. Right? They're social statuses among other social statuses. Local and contextual expertise, including, for example, indigenous expertise, is often attuned to natural and social phenomena in ways that professional and institutional science just isn't. Right? Sometimes they just know better. Right? Farmers that have been farming that land for generations sometimes just know better, right, what will work best in that soil. Right? But this may play out in some cases as part of a corrective in interpretations of scientific content. And in other cases, it can play out as a rejection of science altogether. Okay, so let me take stock. So I began by talking about something that seems crucial for science education, epistemic aims that facilitate the use of scientific findings in pursuit of our well-being. And I've discussed the idea of both skeptical and critical conceptions of the outputs of scientific work, which comprise forms of science denial on the one hand and different epistemologies of science on the other. Science denialism is present in our societies whether we like it or not. And even among expert assessors of the epistemic status of scientific knowledge, we find significant disagreement. So we have ample motivation to think carefully about how best to conceive of our epistemic aims in general science education. But before I proceed to suggest that there is, in fact, a convincing answer to the question of what the primary epistemic aim of a general science education should be, I just want to clear the ground by disposing of a potential challenge to the very legitimacy of trying to answer that question. Right? Worries, like the ones I'll present in just a moment, really stem from concerns about the possibility of so-called epistemic paternalism, and in perhaps its most severe form, indoctrination, both of which stand opposed to the arguably virtuous principle of allowing for epistemic autonomy. Right? So I'll spell out all of that next. So generally, paternalism is identified with systems and practices in which those with authority restrict the freedom of others without their consent and seemingly in their best interests. Autonomy is identified, conversely, with a state of freedom from the control of others, right? Or as it's commonly described, a state of self-governance. In cases where being subject to paternalism is not merely seemingly beneficial, right, but actually beneficial, then paternalism and autonomy can both be associated with certain goods. In the case of paternalism, the promotion of an agent's welfare, right? And in the case of autonomy, a respect for their agency. At first glance, though, given that to act paternalistically is to violate someone's autonomy, and that to be autonomous is to resist paternalism, even in cases where both are desirable, the goods associated with them would seem to be in competition with one another. In those sorts of cases, we have no option but to consider what's preferable on balance. Now, what we're interested in here aren't these very general notions of paternalism and autonomy, but the more specific notions of epistemic paternalism and epistemic autonomy. What's at stake here specifically is what's in one's best epistemic interests in the one case, and one's freedom regarding the formation of one's own beliefs in the other. So putting all of this together, epistemic paternalism is a system or practice in which those in authority interfere with the inquiry of others, right, without their consent and for their epistemic good. Epistemic autonomy is freedom from the control of others, or self-governance, with respect to forming one's own beliefs. In science education, the condition for epistemic paternalism of interference in another one's equality and someone else's, inquiry is almost trivially satisfied, right? I mean, teaching science involves presenting evidence that students likely don't have or that they wouldn't easily acquire otherwise. So that's already interfering. That said, the without consent condition probably isn't satisfied, I think. Whether students explicitly consent to general science education may vary, but their presence in the classroom provides at least some evidence, or so I tell myself, of an implicit consent to being taught. An explicit consent to being presented with evidence, and so on. Even if that consent comes from, say, parents or caregivers who are taken to be responsible for making those choices on behalf of students up to a certain age, right? An age before which they might not be considered in a position to judge, in fact, what would be best in their best epistemic interests. So this suggests that teaching need not be epistemically paternalistic after all, right? So if you're with me so far, then so far so good. But this still leaves open the possibility that the best interests condition isn't satisfied, in which case consent would be unreasonable even if it were sought, right? So let's consider that possibility now. In education, cases in which teachers don't act in the epistemic interests of their students are discussed in terms of indoctrination. In its negative connotation, indoctrination is associated with situations in which, even if there were consent, it would be difficult to maintain that this is in the best interests of an agent. And it will come as a relief to you, I'm sure, that it seems to me that science teaching is not properly thought of as systematically indoctrinating, right? But as I'll now just attempt to clarify, subtleties regarding the epistemic status of science may well give the impression that it is. In older usage, and perhaps still in some quarters, the term indoctrination can have neutral or even positive connotations, right? So referring simply to training or education. But today, certainly in the present context, it's generally used negatively to refer to a process in which students are taught to believe something in the absence of careful attention to reasons and evidence, right? So I'm just drawing here from an influential paper by Ivan Snook. He extracted from the literature, and I'm quoting him here, 3 main candidates for the criterion of indoctrination. The first is intentions to instill beliefs without regard for reasons and evidence. The second is methods of teaching that exclude those kinds of considerations of reason and evidence. And 3, instilling belief in false content. Now, since teaching science typically involves explaining techniques of investigation and how we acquire data and how we analyze the data and so on, there's no case here for indoctrination on criteria like bad intentions and methods. Unless this appeared to just gloss over the fact that younger children are often taught in the absence of evidence that they may just lack the capacity to understand at that stage, I think it's important to note that those sorts of evidential considerations commonly become part of a general science education down the road. So that, I think, all seems fine. But when it comes to the third possible source of indoctrination, right, according to Snook, concerning the epistemic status of the content that's actually presented or instilled, I think the issue is murkier. So consider here a couple of cases that Snook views as clear examples of indoctrination. Right? He gives others, but I'm just focusing on a couple here just to illustrate the idea. So I've labeled them A and B here. Right? A is inculcating content the teacher believes to be false. Right? B, inculcating content the teacher believes to be uncertain as if it were certain. Now, consider the standard science curriculum. Is there an implication when we teach classical mechanics that Newton's theory of gravity is true? Well, it isn't true, right? And presumably teachers know this, right? If it were true, then there would be no need to proceed to Einstein and relativity theory later on. If there were a clear implication in the classroom that classical mechanics is true, that would clearly be an instance of A. Here's another example. Do the subatomic particles constituting atoms and molecules, right? The protons, the neutrons, the electrons of basic chemistry, right? Do those things exist? Well, yes, sort of, right? I mean, in a sense, maybe, but of course there's substantial uncertainty about them, right? They're not particles in any ordinary sense, right? And indeed, there's expert dissensus about whether it makes sense to say that there are in fact particles, right? As opposed to, say, excitation states of some underlying field, or perhaps some other more exotic possibilities. If there were an implication of certainty regarding those sorts of entities in the chemistry classroom, that would be a clear instance of B, right, on the slide, assuming that teachers know better. So those are just a couple of examples. So how might we confirm whether the forms of indoctrination I've just described, or that Snook describes in A and B, are systematically present in a general science education? Well, perhaps the strongest reason to doubt that they are present systematically stems from the fact that the question of whether our best science is true or certain isn't usually a feature of teaching science qua science. Right? For the most part, science pedagogy is exhausted by the presentation and mastery of the face value content of science. It doesn't include detailed, extensive, meta-level reflections on whether or in what sense this content is true or approximately true or idealized or a useful fiction. Right? I mean, arguably, that's what philosophers of science are for. Right? For good or for ill, in contrast to the sorts of conversations that scientists and other scholars of the sciences sometimes have among themselves, general science education isn't ordinarily the place for those sorts of reflections and considerations, right? And nor could it be in any serious way. And as a consequence, it's just difficult to assess the extent to which inquiry into the precise epistemic status of what's being taught may arise in that context, if at all. I know, speaking only for myself, it didn't arise at all. Right? So I don't think there's a basis here on which to conclude that indoctrination per se is constitutive of scientific teaching. Right? On the contrary. Okay, so I've argued that epistemic paternalism is not intrinsic to science teaching as such, given the likelihood of consent, and that the more specific charge of indoctrination, in which consent would be unreasonable in any case, is, I think, difficult to pin on a general science education. That opens or reopens the door, I think, to considering what the epistemic aims of general science education should be. And in a way that takes seriously the challenges represented by the forms of science denialism and epistemologies of science that I discussed just a moment ago. So let's go there now. So realizing the hope of a widespread pro-attitude towards science, which lends support to action and policymaking informed by scientific investigation, requires a correspondingly positive understanding of the epistemic status of science. And I think that's just a matter of doing justice to the actual achievements of scientific work, which are, of course, incredible, right? They're astounding. Additionally, though, and this is something I believe should apply to any goals we may have, not merely the ones that I'm thinking about in this context, a serious aim is something that's achievable, right? Even if only to some appreciable degree, right? At a minimum, an aim should serve as an ideal which, in guiding action, has some significant potential to make an intended difference to what we achieve. If we're going to take seriously the idea of teaching science in ways that may serve human and planetary welfare, it should now, I hope, seem likewise obvious that in general science education, we should be aspiring to aims that take seriously and are somehow responsive to science denialism and the fact of different epistemologies of science. Forms of science denialism, right, pseudoscience, anti-science, resistance to facts, incorporate straightforwardly negative conceptions of the epistemic status of the sciences. Epistemologies of science present deeply entrenched, conflicting assessments of that epistemic status. Ideally, then, I submit that the primary epistemic aim of a general science education should be something that's compatible with both of these very different takes on the epistemic status of our best science, the positive and the negative. And of course, I appreciate that that's a provocative thing to say. Right? I suspect the initial reaction from those of us, certainly who were trained in the sciences, is to react very strongly against that idea. Right? One might think, shouldn't we just insist that students believe our best science? Right? So let me try to convince you now that that really isn't the best way forward, right? At least so far as the primary aim of a general science education is concerned. An aim that's incompatible with the full range of the epistemic status of science that I just mentioned is bound to be substantially suboptimally fulfilled. Right? As I noted earlier, an aim that lacks significant potential for substantial realization, even if it's incomplete, isn't really a serious candidate for being the primary aim of something. The context of a general science education is one in which agents do, in fact, assess the epistemic status of science differently. And with all the evidence and reasoning in the world, there are limits to our powers of persuasion. It's not uncommon, for instance, in cases of science denialism, for people to arrive in the classroom with deeply entrenched background commitments or belief systems that are incompatible with belief in certain scientific claims or theories. For example, about climate change. Now, if you are completely undaunted by the limits of persuasion, right, perhaps one might insist that the primary aim of a general science education must conform to just one of the conflicting views in the epistemology of science that I mentioned above. But I think that inevitably runs contrary, it runs into the worry of violating the epistemic autonomy of students. A good science education will surely involve considerations of the evidence for scientific claims and theories, but it's dubious that it can or should say anything about whatever contrary, deeply entrenched, non-scientific background commitments some students may have that render them hostile to science or unsure about science, or about how best to interpret it. It should not demand that students adopt any one particular epistemology of science. Strongly held background commitments, to people, to groups, to institutions, to forms of life that are skeptical of science or that engage critically with science are sometimes central to the self-identities of those who hold them, right? And that isn't something that can be tackled in any direct way, let alone policed in science teaching. Not least because to do so would amount to a major departure from the actual teaching of science. Right? Then we'd be doing something else. So with this in mind, let's return now to the question of whether there's anything that could serve as a primary epistemic aim for a general science education that's compatible with both positive and negative assessments of the epistemic status of science. And that seems daunting because none of the most commonly discussed epistemic attitudes, right, belief, taking something to be true, disbelief, taking something to be false, a suspension of belief, right, that is agnosticism concerning truth or falsity, none of those things would fit the bill. Right? I mean, taking our most warranted scientific claims and theories to be true would clearly serve the goal of helping to facilitate the uptake of science in society, but it's incompatible with science denialism. Taking our best science to be false goes well with science denialism, but not with the uptake of science in society. A general agnosticism about the epistemic status of science is just a poor fit all around, I think. So there are, no doubt, other achievements that one might champion here, and some people in the literature, in the philosophy of education do, right? They say, well, maybe all we need to do is to make sure they understand the science, right? In contrast to believing or disbelieving it, or being agnostic about the truth of it. And maybe we should be content with their learning variously related skills of scientific thinking and tools of analysis. And granted, all of those things would be an impressive achievement. I think we do need to try to teach them those things. But I don't think that things like that are an ultimate or foundational aim in themselves. I think they're instrumental to something more. That's precisely what I'm grasping for, the fundamental aim. And in any case, learning these things all by themselves won't help to improve the uptake of science in society. You can understand a theory perfectly, right, but not take it to be a reason to use it in policy that may affect all of society. So we need something stronger, some stronger medicine here. And that brings me finally to acceptance. Acceptance is an attitude that's weaker than belief and stronger than agnosticism, right, in the following senses. Belief involves taking something to be true, but acceptance involves only the weaker commitment to use something as though it were true for some purpose. For example, the use of a claim or theory as a means to, or as a premise or basis for, making decisions about how to act. So acceptance and belief are compatible attitudes because regarding something as true trivially entails that you may regard it as though it were true to some end. And if you believe something, this plausibly indicates that you should also rely on that something, where relevant, in determining how to act, right? Just as in acceptance. That said, acceptance doesn't require belief, right? You may accept that Newtonian physics is an excellent means by which to calculate how to get a space shuttle to the International Space Station, right? And yet you might not believe that it's true. In fact, that's what we do. We use Newton's theory to make precisely those kinds of calculations, right? It's just an excellent problem-solving tool for a huge variety of cases. So belief entails acceptance, but acceptance doesn't entail belief. The sense in which acceptance is stronger than agnosticism has to be understood a little bit differently. Acceptance involves making a commitment to whatever's under consideration, right? A claim, a theory, a model, such that it can serve as a basis for action, but agnosticism all by itself is weaker, that it involves making no such commitment. Still, acceptance and agnosticism are also compatible with one another, right? If you accept something, but you don't believe it, that may be because you're agnostic about whether it's true or false. But agnosticism doesn't require acceptance, right? You may be agnostic about Newtonian physics, for instance, and not even accept it. Now, perhaps all of this is too much comparing and contrasting. I could go on about the logical relationships between belief and acceptance and agnosticism. But I think that's probably enough. Right? The idea here is not to get carried away with all the comparing and contrasting, but merely to understand the sense in which agnosticism is a kind of middle road in a way that will work out very nicely for the project of trying to determine what the right epistemic aim might serve as primary for science education. Right? So the idea here is really just to clarify the relevant concept, and with that in hand, I think we're well equipped now to see why acceptance may succeed as the primary aim for general science education, where belief and agnosticism just can't. Right? And the key is that acceptance is the only doxastic attitude that combines neutrality with respect to the epistemic status of our best science with a positive assessment of its utility. Given that acceptance commits us to using something, in this case the content of scientific theories and models, as a basis for decision-making about how to act, it emphasizes the remarkable problem-solving capacities of the sciences in teaching. There are successes in terms of prediction and manipulation and designing amazingly effective technologies, right, and so on. And this is clearly, I think, our best bet for developing a broader understanding of the power and efficacy of the sciences in the public, and thereby promoting the uptake of science in society. Okay, so I think that just leaves one last roadblock to overcome. But in light of the time, I'm not going to say much about this. I'll just mention it very quickly. Of the various forms of science denialism that we considered earlier, pseudoscience, anti-science, resistance to facts, they're all typified by a rejection of belief in our best science. But the case of anti-science, I think, is unique, right? In the sense that, unlike the other cases of science denialism, what's really interesting about anti-science is that it seems to reject any sort of doxastic attitude with respect to the science, because the whole point of anti-science is not to be driven by any epistemic aims, right? In a sense, the epistemic aims are irrelevant, right? And so I make a case in the paper for why it makes sense to set anti-science aside here in thinking about what the proper epistemic aim of a science education should be, because anti-science actually places no constraints on what those aims should be. It isn't even in the business of thinking about what the proper epistemic aims might be. I'm happy to talk about that more later, but in the interest of time, let me move on to the last thing that I want to say. Having said all of the preceding, I suspect that some may still be worried. It's only natural, I think, that advocates of the sciences may feel unsatisfied with anything less than belief as the primary aim of science. Pseudoscience, for instance, it has in some cases done substantial harm to people and the planet, and some may feel that the only adequate epistemic aim for general science education is to instill belief in the content of our best science. I empathize with this, but I also think that we have to live in the world. I mean, the actual world. Right? A Gallup poll in 2023 found that only 24% of people in the United States believe the theory of evolution. 24%. 37% believe creationism. Right? That's the idea that God created humans in essentially their current form sometime in the last 10,000 years. A further 34% believe something like intelligent design, the sort of souped up version of creationism that suggests that God guided the process of human evolution. Right? Those are striking numbers, right? That's a very large majority that reject the theory of evolution, at least in its scientific form. Those are striking numbers now well into the 21st century, not only for philosophers of education, but insofar as we want people to act on our best science, right, to take vaccines, to behave in climate-friendly ways, and so on, acceptance is sufficient because it shares all of the practical virtues of belief. And even if one doesn't share that motivation, right, or care very much about it, I think the moral of this discussion today should still ring true, right? Students bring a diversity of commitments to a general science education, some of which they hold very deeply and would not be willing to give up. And there are many open questions that even advocates of the sciences, like almost all of those who have sophisticated epistemologies of science, may reasonably debate about how justifications for belief can arise from empirically successful theories and models, right? That are nonetheless imperfect in many ways that we can elaborate, and in other ways that we just don't know yet, right? And that we may never know. Whatever other attitudes students may end up with having about science, they should minimally end up with a firmly committed acceptance. That's the most important and the most practicable thing a teacher can instill. And in some cases, it will be the best they can do, right? I mean, not merely realistically speaking, but also in principle. And so, I submit, while leaving the door open to belief for those who find themselves convinced to a greater degree, acceptance and not belief is the primary aim of a general science education. Thanks a lot.